A tree on the amenity green opposite my flat has been replaced by an absolutely huge electronic advertising screen. This isn't very green, is it? I thought we were in the middle of a climate crisis. Could you please explain why permission was granted for this monstrosity? We weren't consulted.
Welcome to Better Without Billboards, a podcast from Adfree Cities all about outdoor advertising, why it's bad and what we can do to reclaim our public spaces. Today we have a special episode all about the launch of our latest research on outdoor advertising and inequality. We launched the research with an event in Parliament, and some of this episode was recorded live at the event, so apologies for some slightly dodgy audio quality at times. The new research is absolutely brilliant and cracks the lid on an issue often hidden in plain sight, and that is the concentration of outdoor advertising in parts of towns and cities already struggling against higher deprivation and air pollution. So, let's join Nicola and James in the studio where they're discussing the research and what it all means.
Planning system reform. 3 words guaranteed to clear the room at a party. And yet, planning system reform might just hold the key to overturning decades of inequality across the UK. At least, that's according to new research from Adfree Cities. Our report, titled Unavoidable Impact, How Outdoor Advertising Placement Relates to Health and Wealth Inequalities, for the first time makes clear the disproportionate placement of outdoor advertising in areas of higher deprivation, lower income and higher air pollution. The research makes clear the case for urgent planning reform that would make putting up new adverts harder and blocking planning applications easier for communities and local authorities. So I'm Nicola Round from Adfree Cities, and with me is James Ward.
Hello.
So James, this new research seems to verify a hunch that I suspect many people have had, that outdoor advertising, so that's things like billboards, bus stop ads, freestanding ad screens, that they tend to be concentrated in less well-off areas. Is that right?
Yeah, the whole project leading to this research was motivated by our experience in Bristol, where we know that areas like Lawrence Hill, Easton, some of the city's more deprived wards have up to 3 times as many adverts and planning applications for new adverts compared to some of the wealthier areas. So this report, Unavoidable Impact, takes this hunch to the national level. We analyse over 83,000 roadside ads, like you say, things like billboards and bus stops, phone boxes, to show how overwhelmingly outdoor advertising is found in areas of lower incomes, higher air pollution and greater deprivation.
Well, it sounds like a lot of work's gone into that. Can you give me some headline stats from the report?
I can give you some headline stats. So, we found that across England there is over 6 times more advertising in the most deprived decile, or 10% of areas, than in the least deprived decile. Looking at income across England and Wales, 82%, so 4/5 of outdoor advertising, is in the poorest half of England and Wales. And 98% of outdoor advertising is in the most polluted half of England and Wales. I mean, that's the national picture, but it's also mirrored in our city case studies of Sheffield and Leeds. So what that demonstrates is that even within cities, there is this clear disparity between more and less deprived neighbourhoods, with the former having far, far more outdoor advertising. And, we can talk about the numbers, but what underpins all this are the stories, right? So we've heard a little bit at the beginning of this episode of Julia from Dagenham and her story about how this issue really impacts people's lives. And ultimately, that's what this is about, and that's what we're campaigning on, is to change the harm that outdoor advertising is causing on I don't think it's an overstatement to say, daily basis.
Yeah, so we heard from Julia in the introduction, and she was speaking at the launch of the research at an event in Parliament on March the 5th this year. So let's hear a little more of Julia's story now. And apologies for the audio quality, it was recorded live, so there's a little bit of background noise.
On their website, Clear Channel tell their potential advertisers, consumers are desensitised to online and TV advertising, whereas out-of-home advertising puts brands in front of people in situations where they are not constantly being bombarded by other ads. In other words, they are unavoidable. We just don't need these things on the street. They make local residents feel angry, helpless and used. Our communities are not just places that people drive through on their way to somewhere else. We live here.
And Julia's story isn't a one-off. We've got extensive testimonials from Bristol residents about the negative impacts of two massive digital ad screens in particular, which are above the M32, which cuts through areas of East Bristol. And there's over 100 of these testimonials collected by the local Adblock group here, Adblock Bristol. And people, describe these ad screens as dystopian. They remark on how they diminish, residents' sense of place and pride in where they live. And I've pulled out some of the quotes from those testimonials, and I'll just read through a few of them now because they're really powerful. So one person said, "I find them impossible to ignore, and this makes me feel resentful that people are allowed to dominate that stretch of road to try and sell something that I have no interest in and has no connection to the local area." Somebody else commented, "The billboard light shines into our bedroom window. The billboards are horrible to look at and affect my sleep." And then a third one there, "I find it very intrusive in my life. The screens lower my mood and make me feel sad." And so this is what I'm talking about when, behind those numbers that I quoted earlier, there are so many of these stories. Outdoor advertising is perhaps not seen as a priority issue for a lot of people, and that's fair enough. In a time of climate crisis, cost of living crisis, it can seem like a background issue. But I think what we really want to get across with this research and with these kind of testimonials is that this is something that is affecting people's lives on a daily basis, and it is something that's worthy of our attention. We're going to talk a little bit later about the kind of reforms that we could see. Very simple reforms that will make a huge difference in people's lives.
Wow, yeah. I mean, the impacts seem really clear. It makes you wonder what the advertising companies think about all of that and the impacts on people living near them. But I think, one of the things people are going to be wondering is why? Why is it happening? Why do we see such a concentration of advertising in more deprived areas? What's the reason?
It's a good question. So, as you would expect, adverts don't go up at random, right? Ad companies choose locations where they think their ads will be seen, areas of high footfall, high traffic, next to roads, for instance, and in high footfall areas like busy high streets. Now, where the problem arises is in how this is currently governed by a planning system that dates back to, in many parts, the 1960s, and is even before that based on ideas dating back to the Victorian era. So at the moment, how it works is an ad company wants to put up a new billboard, say. They have to submit a planning application. That's reviewed by a local council. The only reason that council has to refuse that planning application is, one of two things. One is road safety. So is that advert going to distract drivers, for instance? And the other one is what's called amenity. Now, this is a very kind of nebulous concept. What does amenity even mean? And basically, it's a kind of a coded word for how attractive an area is. The consequence of this is that ads get placed in areas already deemed to be of low amenity, kind of quote unquote low amenity. Or in other words, ad companies look at a street, decide that it looks, a bit rough, maybe there's some litter, maybe it's a little bit underinvested in places, but then they use that assessment as justification to put in a new billboard. So it's kind of crazy, right? There's a circular logic there. It's like ad companies, they accept that billboards make an area worse, but they use the fact that the area is already underinvested as justification for doing that. And then there's this other kind of deeper issue in that ad companies have all the power here when it comes to making planning applications. It's a very time-consuming, resource-intensive process, but a large company like JCDecaux, Global, Clear Channel, these are big international organizations, billion-pound organizations. They can afford to have a person submitting these applications over and over again, multiple applications in multiple towns and cities, which makes it very, very difficult for local people to object. So we see this in Bristol, for instance. An application might be submitted for a new advertising site, a new billboard, for instance, and it might get refused. But then a year later, an identical application appears for the same billboard, the same site, submitted by the same ad company, and they'll just do this year on year on year until it gets through, until people forget to object or the council just gets sick and tired of dealing with it and puts it through. So at Adfree Cities, we've got a wonderful network of local ad block groups around the country who do an absolutely fantastic job of kind of jumping on these applications and objecting to them. But ultimately, like I say, the power lies with the ad companies who just have the time and the people power and the resources to overwhelm any local defences that might exist.
So you talked earlier about some of the really genuine harms and impacts that these digital advertising screens are causing on people. Things like shining into their bedrooms, not letting them sleep at night, being very intrusive. Sounds like these are really important issues for people to raise in this what sounds like quite a complex and difficult to engage with planning system. So it seems like the system's really working against people's needs. But what do the ad companies say about it? Presumably they don't see themselves as being particularly harmful?
No, so I mean, if you were to speak to the advertising companies like JCDecaux or Clear Channel, they'll say that they're providing a public service, right? So there's an industry body called Outsmart, and they like to claim that the ad industry invests £411 million a year into the economy. They had a big report out last year that kind of came to that conclusion. But when we looked into those figures, we found that of this supposed public spending, 96% is the result of legal and contractual obligations, like rent and paying business rates. So, like, every business operating in the UK has to pay those. It's not out the goodness of the ad industry's heart that they're contributing that money. And to present it as such, I think is, incredibly disingenuous. And then, of course, there's the question of who's actually using these advertising sites. So if you think about what you see on billboards, it's not your local independent businesses. It's McDonald's, it's KFC, it's Subway, it's SUVs, it's flights, it's fast fashion. And the ad industry's own data shows the biggest spender on outdoor advertising is indeed McDonald's. So we have these ad screens, these billboards, disproportionately placed in more deprived areas or quote-unquote low amenity areas, broadcasting ads for unhealthy food, for environmentally damaging products, things that are making life worse for the very people who are most exposed to these ads. This is not an industry that is contributing. It's not an industry that's adding to our lives, to our communities. It's an industry that is taking away from them.
So, it's clear then that some kind of action is needed. You've mentioned already that regulation of outdoor ads is outdated. Maybe you could just say a little bit more about that. What do you think the alternatives are?
Yeah, great question. So when we launched this research in Parliament, I had a chance to speak to Green Party councillor from Bristol and parliamentary hopeful, Carla Denyer. Let's listen to a little bit of what she had to say on this.
The trouble is that councils are limited in what they can do about outdoor advertising because of rules set at a national level. It's very difficult as a local councillor, which I've been in Bristol since 2015, to make the case under existing planning legislation to turn down billboards because the rules restrict the grounds on which we can do that. So councils are only allowed to refuse planning permission for advertising on the basis of highway safety, so if it would be so distracting that it might cause an accident, or on amenity, which is a pretty poorly defined concept about the well-being of local residents. And it is sometimes possible to argue that a new billboard would affect the amenity of local residents, but it's a bit of a slippery concept, so it can be difficult to argue sometimes. And there is no grounds for turning down applications for adverts on the basis of light pollution, on the basis of environmental impact either of the adverts themselves or of the products they're advertising, even though, or on the, for example, mental health impacts of the products they're advertising, given that a lot of advertising basically works on the premise of telling you that you're not good enough unless you buy this product. So there's a lot more that I think national government could do to empower local councils to better represent their residents and what they want their local city or town to look like.
So this is confusing, isn't it? Planning decisions are made by local councils, but we're talking now about national changes to the law.
Yep, yeah, exactly. So basically, councils make decisions on planning applications, but they do so within the limits set by law, which in this case would be the Town and Country Planning Act. And that's where the ideas of road safety and amenity come from. So what we're calling for with this research, and more widely, is reform to the law which would broaden the scope within which councils can say no to new ad sites, to include, for instance, public health and the climate and ecological impacts of advertising. And in addition to that, we want to see a change so that proposals for planning permission for new advertisements should include a requirement to carry out pre-application consultation, which is already a requirement for a lot of building works. If you want to put up a new building, you have to actively go out and consult the nearby community, but to put up a new advert, you don't. So we want to see a requirement to carry out pre-application consultation, including writing to affected persons for any ad company that wants to install a new advertisement near any kind of residential area.
Well, that does sound like it would start to address the imbalance of power within this whole system. But hang on, if a council does decide to reject a planning application, is that not the end of it?
Well, you would like to think so, but unfortunately, no. So within the planning system, an ad company puts in an application, it gets refused. What they can then do is make an appeal, right? And that goes to beyond the council. It goes to the planning inspectorate, who review the decision made and can potentially overturn it. And again, this is an area where the power is just so imbalanced in favor of the ad companies. So even though it's largely unfair at that first stage of the planning application, local people can make objections. You can go to your local council's planning website, you can make an objection. If that decision goes to appeal, you lose that possibility. So local people can no longer even submit evidence to that planning inquiry, to that appeal process. So once again, it's just an example of how the deck is stacked in favour of the ad companies. It's stacked in favour of more ad sites being built at every possible turn.
So, why do you think it's important for us to do this now, particularly?
So obviously the need for reform has been very clear for a long time to those of us who kind of work in this area. But one thing that's making this very relevant, increasingly so, is the rise in popularity of digital advertising screens. Okay? So whereas billboards used to be paper and paste, a chap came along on a ladder every 2 weeks and slapped up a new billboard poster. Nowadays what we see is those are being replaced by digital screens made up of thousands of little LED bulbs. So these are capable of changing display every few seconds, displaying multiple ads a minute. They can be remotely programmed, so you don't need that chap with his ladder and bucket of paste to come out anymore. It's just someone in Clear Channel HQ, maybe not even in the UK, can program the adverts that appear on that screen in your local town. And we're seeing these more and more and more appearing across the country, not just in billboard form, but you might have seen these on the street, like freestanding ad screens. There's loads of these in Bristol, right? In the kind of shopping areas. And the problems with these are kind of obvious, right? I mean, firstly, they're far more intrusive. It's a digital screen. It's shining light into the local area. You can see them from miles around, potentially. So they're far more intrusive. And, we've heard that in Julia's story, in those testimonials from Bristol. Secondly, they use huge amounts of energy. Right, a digital billboard, for instance, can consume as much electricity as 11 average UK homes. 11 homes in a time of climate crisis, cost of living crisis. It's a pretty egregious use of electricity. And then thirdly, there are the privacy issues with these things. So digital billboards and ad screens come equipped with this whole array of kind of surveillance technology. So we're talking facial recognition cameras, we're talking sensors that are able to read the search history and location data of passers-by, which they then use to decide which ads to display, all the better to target you as a passerby and sell you things that you didn't even know you needed. So to put this in kind of context, right, the current regulations, the Town and Country Planning Act, was last updated, certainly for England, in 2007. Now, for context, 2007 was the year the first iPhone was released. So imagine if we regulated like digital communications as a whole, using laws from 2007, laws written before the invention of smartphones. Like that would be crazy, right? And yet that's exactly what we're doing with outdoor advertising. There is a clear, urgent need for reform, for an updated planning system that puts power back in the hands of local people and local councils to get ahead of this surge of digital advertising, to rebalance the scales in favour of people rather than these faceless advertising corporations, and ultimately to say no to more outdoor advertising.
Yeah, do you know what? I've stood next to one of those really big digital screens. They are ginormous, aren't they? I would not want one of those outside my house.
No.
And those smaller standalone units, sometimes they just look like they've been plonked right in the middle of a pedestrian walkway, right? With no regard really for anyone else who's using that space.
Yeah. So that's something else with these as well. These freestanding screens, often they're put on pavements which are already very narrow. A lot of towns and cities in the UK were built 1,000 years ago. We have narrow streets, and if you take up a portion of that with what we're talking about, 4 foot wide ad screen, that really makes a difference for people who perhaps already have mobility issues.
Yeah. Okay, so what else could we change, do you think, to make the system fairer? Got any other ideas?
So there's a few things in this research that we're calling for. One is the rebalancing of the current planning system. A second call that we're putting out is to, in the same way that back in the noughties, in the 2010s, councils took a presumption against fracking, right, to stop new fracking sites being opened on land that they controlled. So we want to see a kind of similar thing for advertising, right? Councils to introduce a presumption against new advertising, which would really help rebalance the scales in favour of local people and send a very clear message to advertising companies that new ad sites are not welcome. And then a final thing that we recommend in the report is to introduce new legislation, again, enabling councils to get ahead of harmful advertising content, right? So yeah, we want to stop new advertising sites being built, but the fact is there are already many, many thousands of them out there, which are probably going to be around for a long time. So let's at least make sure that the ads that are being displayed are not displaying, harmful or unhealthy products. So, what does that mean? It means kind of strictly limiting the kinds of, junk food advertising or alcohol advertising, gambling, payday loans, all those kind of things. It means high carbon products as well. So we want to see a limit on, or a ban even, on advertising for things like SUVs, for flights, for fossil fuels, obviously. So the most polluting products as well, the most environmentally harmful products, we would no longer see advertised on our streets and in our public spaces. So between those kind of three recommendations, right, it's broadening the grounds for councils to say no, it's a presumption against new advertising sites, and it's a ban on harmful ad content. We think those three together, well, firstly, would be incredibly simple to enact, right? These aren't huge, expensive changes to policy. These would be relatively simple to enact. But they would also go a huge way towards empowering communities and local people to decide, once again, what their public spaces look like, instead of having ad corporations do that for them.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be behind those changes. I mean, someone like Julia probably doesn't want anyone else having to wake up one morning with a digital screen right outside their house shining through their window and having this ongoing fight against it to claim back the public space that she used to enjoy. So what can people listening to this podcast do about it?
So, we've got a number of ways to get involved. So if you head to our website, adfreecities.org.uk, or obviously just, search for us online, you'll find a number of ways to get involved. So we've got ways that you can write to your MP and raise this as a political issue to support the recommendations that we make in this research report. But if that's not for you, it's not for everyone, and you want to be even more involved, you want to do something a bit more hands-on, really the best thing you can do is find and join your local adblock group. For those who don't know, adblock groups are our kind of grassroots volunteer groups across the country. We've got quite a few now, right? There's one in Bristol, one in Leeds, one in Norwich. There's an adblock Manchester. Apologies to adblock groups that I'm forgetting about. But yeah, like I say, these are groups of volunteers who do everything from objecting to planning applications for new ad sites where they live, up to engaging local councils on the issue, to engaging the public on the issue with kind of creative or artistic ways of raising awareness about the harms that advertising causes in our public spaces. So yeah, like I say, head to our website, find out more about adblock groups, find out more about different ways of getting involved. But yeah, we're always keen to have more people, raising this issue wherever they live. And I think, that's one thing that's come out of the work that we've done over the years is just how many people are worried about this, right? Quite a regular thing that people might not have heard of us per se, but they're worried about the issue. So it's always heartening to hear that. And, there's a lot of people out there who want to see something done about this. So yeah, get involved.
Great. There's loads of ways to get involved there. And thanks for talking about this today, James. So today we've been talking about Adfree City's new report, Unavoidable Impact. And at the launch of this research on March the 5th in Westminster, Caroline Lucas MP spoke. And I just wanted to finish by reading out something that Caroline said, because it highlights why this work is so important. On a finite planet, we simply have to confront the truth that advertising's role is driving endless consumption in pursuit of infinite economic growth. And that's in direct conflict with our ability to thrive and indeed with the very livability of our shared future. So I think it's no overstatement to say that the issues with which this report deals really are a matter of life and death for all of us. So we'll leave you with that thought from Caroline Lucas there. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, then please subscribe, and if you can, please share this podcast with a friend or two. To find out more about Adfree Cities' work, head to adfreecities.org.uk or find us on Twitter and Instagram at AdfreeCities. Thanks for listening, and fuck adverts.